Revolution at Point Zero: Housework, Reproduction, and Feminist Struggle by Silvia Federici. Part 3: Reproducing Commons. Section 1: On Elder Care and the Limits of Marxism, 2009. Introduction. Care work, especially elder care, has come in recent years to the center of public attention in the countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, in response to a number of trends that have put many traditional forms of assistance into crisis. First among these trends have been the growth, in relative and absolute terms, of the old age population and the increase in life expectancy, that have not been matched, however, by a growth of services catering to the old. There has also been the expansion of women's waged employment that has reduced their contribution to the reproduction of their families. To these factors, we must add the continuing process of urbanization and the gentrification of working-class neighborhoods that have destroyed the support networks and the forms of mutual aid on which older people living alone could once rely, as neighbors would bring them food, make their beds, come for a chat. As a result of these trends, for a large number of elderly, the positive effects of a longer lifespan have been voided or are clouded by the prospect of loneliness, social exclusion, and increased vulnerability to physical and psychological abuse. With this in mind, I present some reflections on the question of elder care in contemporary social policy, especially in the United States, to then ask what action can be taken on this terrain and why the question of elder care is absent in the literature of the radical left. My main objective here is to call for a redistribution of the social wealth in the direction of elder care and the construction of collective forms of reproduction, enabling old people to be provided for when no longer self-sufficient, and not at the cost of their providers' lives. For this to occur, however, the struggle over elder care must be politicized and placed on the agenda of social justice movements. A cultural revolution is also necessary in the concept of old age, against its degraded representation as a fiscal burden on the state, on the one side, and on the other, an optional stage in life that we can overcome and even prevent if we adopt the right medical technology and the life-enhancing devices disgorged by the market. At stake in the politicization of elder care are not only the destinies of older people and the unsustainability of radical movements failing to address such a crucial issue in our lives, but the possibility of generational and class solidarity, which for years have been the targets of relentless campaign by political economists and governments, portraying the provisions which workers have won for their old age, such as pensions and other forms of social security, as an economic time bomb and a heavy mortgage on the future of the young. The crisis of elder care in the global era. In some respects, the present crisis of elder care is nothing new. Elder care in capitalist society has always been in a state of crisis, both because of the devaluation of reproductive work in capitalism and because the elderly are seen as no longer productive, instead of being treasured as they were in many pre-capitalist societies as depositories of the collective memory and experience. In other words, elder care suffers from a double cultural and social devaluation. Like all reproductive work, it is not recognized as work, but unlike the reproduction of labor power, whose product has a recognized value, it is deemed to absorb value but not to produce it. Thus, funds designated for elder care have traditionally been dispersed with a stinginess reminiscent of the 19th century poor laws, as the task of caring for the old who are no longer self-sufficient has been left to the families and kin with little external support, on the assumption that women should naturally take on this task as part of their domestic work. It has taken a long struggle to force capital to reproduce not just labor power in use, but the working class throughout its entire life cycle, with the provision of assistance also to those who are no longer part of the labor market. However, even the Keynesian state fell short of this goal. Witness the Social Security legislation of the New Deal, enacted in 1940 in the United States and considered one of the achievements of our century. Only partly did it respond to the problems faced by the old, as it tied social insurance to the years of waged employment and provided elder care only to those in a state of absolute poverty. The triumph of neoliberalism has worsened the situation. In some countries of the OECD, steps have been taken in the 1990s to increase the funding of home-based care and provide counseling and services to caregivers. In England, the government has given caregivers the right to demand flexible work schedules from employers so they can reconcile wage work and care work. But the dismantling of the welfare state and the neoliberal insistence that reproduction is the worker's personal responsibility have triggered a counter-tendency that is gaining momentum, and the present economic crisis will undoubtedly accelerate. The demise of welfare provisions for the elderly has been especially severe in the United States, where it has reached such a point that workers are often impoverished in the effort to care for a disabled parent. One policy in particular has created great hardships. This has been the transfer of much hospital care to the home, a move motivated by purely financial concerns and carried out with little consideration given to the structures required to replace the services that hospitals used to provide. As described by Nona Glaser, this development has not only increased the amount of care work that family members, mostly women, must do, it has also shifted to the home dangerous and even life-threatening operations that in the past only registered nurses and hospitals would have expected to perform. At the same time, subsidized home care workers have seen their workload double, while the length of their visits has increasingly been cut, forcing them to reduce their jobs to household maintenance and bodily care. Federally financed nursing homes have also been tailorized, using time and motion studies to decide how many patients their workers can be expected to serve. The globalization of elder care in the 1980s and 1990s has not remedied this situation. The new International Division of Reproductive Work that globalization has promoted has shifted a large amount of care work on the shoulders of immigrant women. This development has been very advantageous for governments, enabling them to save billions of dollars they otherwise would have had to pay to provide services catering to the elderly. It has also enabled many elderly who wish to maintain their independence to remain in their homes without going bankrupt. But this cannot be considered a solution to elder care, short of a total social and economic transfer in the conditions of care workers and the factors motivating their choice of this work. It is because of the destructive impact of economic liberalization and structural adjustment in their countries of origins that millions of women from Africa, Asia, the Caribbean islands, and the former socialist world migrate to the more affluent regions of Europe, the Middle East, and the United States to serve as nannies, domestics, and caregivers for the elders. To this, they must leave their own families, including children and aging parents, behind, and recruit relatives or hire other women with less power and resources than themselves to replace the work they can no longer provide. Taking the case of Italy as an example, it is calculated that 3 out of 4 badanti, as care workers for the elderly are called, have children of their own, but only 15% have their families with them. This means that the majority suffer a great deal of anxiety, confronting the fact that their own families must go without the same care they now give to people across the globe. Arlie Hochschild has spoken in this context of a global transfer of care and emotions, and the formation of a global care chain. But the chain often breaks down. Immigrant women become estranged from their children, stipulated arrangements fall apart, relatives die during their absence. Equally important, because of the devaluation of reproductive work and the fact that they are immigrants, often undocumented, and women of color, paid care workers are vulnerable to a great deal of blackmail and abuse. Long hours of work, no paid vacations or other benefits, exposure to racist behavior, and sexual assault. So low is the pay of home care workers in the United States that nearly half must rely on food stamps and other forms of public assistance to make ends meet. Indeed, as Domestic Workers United, the main domestic care workers organization in New York State, promoter of a domestic workers' bill of rights, has put it, care workers live and work in the shadow of slavery. It is also important to stress that most elderly people and families cannot afford hiring care workers or paying for services matching their real need. This is particularly true of elderly people with disabilities who require day-long care. According to statistics of the CNEL of 2003, in Italy only 2.8% of elderly receive non-family assistance at home. In France it is twice as many, in Germany 3 times. but the number is still low. A large number of elderly live alone, facing hardships that are all the more devastating the more invisible they are. In the hot summer of 2003, thousands of elderly people died throughout Europe of dehydration, lack of food and medicines, or just the unbearable heat. So many died in Paris that the authorities had to stack their bodies in refrigerated public spaces until their families reclaimed them. When family members care for the old, the tasks fall mostly on the shoulders of women, who for months or years at a time live in the verge of nervous and physical exhaustion, consumed by the work and the responsibility of having to provide a care and often perform procedures for which they are usually unprepared. Many have jobs outside the home, though they have to abandon them when the care work intensifies. Particularly stressed are the sandwich generation, who are simultaneously raising children and caring for their parents. The crisis of care work has reached such a point that in low-income single-parent families in the United States, children and teenagers, some no more than 11 years old, take care of their elders, also administering therapies and injections. As the New York Times has reported, a study conducted nationwide in 2005 revealed that 3% of households with children ages 8 to 18 included child caregivers. The alternative for those who cannot afford buying some form of assisted care are publicly funded nursing homes, which, however, are more like prisons than hostels for the old. Typically, due to the lack of staff and funds, these institutions provide minimal care. At best, they let their residents lie in bed for hours without anyone at hand to change their positions, adjust their pillows, massage their legs, tend to their bed sores, or simply talk to them. Basic elements in maintaining a sense of identity and dignity and still feeling alive and valued. At worst, nursing homes are places where old people are drugged, tied to their beds, left to lie in their excrements, and subjected to all kinds of physical and psychological abuses. This much has emerged from a series of reports, including one recently published by the U.S. government in 2008, which speaks of a history of abuse, neglect, and a violation of safety and health standards in 94% of nursing homes. The situation is not more encouraging in other countries. In Italy, reports of abuses in nursing homes perpetrated against disabled or chronically ill elders are very frequent, as are the cases in which needed medical assistance is denied. Eldercare, the unions, and the left. The problems I have described are so common and pressing that we would imagine that eldercare should top the agenda of social justice movements and labor unions internationally. This, however, is not the case. When not working in institutions, as it is the case with nurses and aides, care workers have been ignored by labor unions, even the most combative like Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU. Unions negotiate pensions, the conditions of retirement, and health care, but there is little discussion in their programs of the support systems required by people aging and by care workers, whether or not they work for pay. In the United States, until recently, labor unions did not even try to organize care workers, much less unpaid house workers. Thus, to this day, care workers working for individuals or families have been excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act, a New Deal legislation that guarantees access to minimum wages, overtime, bargaining rights, and other workplace protections. As already mentioned, among the 50 states, only New York State has so far recognized care workers as workers, with the passing of a Bill of Rights in November 2010 that Domestic Workers United had long fought for, and the United States is not an isolated case. According to an ILO survey of 2004, cross-national unionization rates in the domestic service sector are barely 1%. Pensions, too, are not available to all workers, but only to those who have worked for wages, and certainly not to unpaid family caregivers. Because reproductive work is not recognized as work, and pension systems compute benefits on the basis of years spent in waged employment, women who have been full-time housewives can obtain a pension only through a wage-earning husband and have no Social Security in the case they divorce. Labor organizations have not challenged these inequities, nor have social movements and the Marxist left, who, with few exceptions, seems to have written off the elderly from the struggle, judging by the absence of any reference to elder care in contemporary Marxist analysis. The responsibility for this state of affairs can be in part traced back to Marx himself. Elder care is not a theme that we find in his works, although the question of old age had been on the revolutionary political agenda since the 18th century, and mutual aid societies and utopian visions of recreated communities, Fourierist, Owenite, Icarian, abounded in this time. Marx was concerned with understanding the mechanics of capitalist production and the manifold ways in which class struggle challenges it and reshapes its form. Security in old age and elder care did not enter this discussion. Old age was a rarity among the factory workers and miners of his time, whose life expectancy on average in industrial areas like Manchester and Liverpool did not surpass 30 years at best, if the reports of Marx's contemporaries are to be believed. Most importantly, Marx did not recognize the centrality of reproductive work, neither for the capital accumulation nor for the construction of the new communist society. Although both him and Engels described the abysmal conditions in which the working class in England lived and worked, he almost naturalized the process of reproduction, never envisioning how reproductive work could be reorganized in a post-capitalist society or in the very course of the struggle. For instance, he discussed cooperation only in the process of commodity production, overlooking the qualitatively different forms of proletarian cooperation in the process of reproduction, which Kropotkin later called mutual aid. Cooperation among workers is for Marx a fundamental characteristic of capitalist organization of work, entirely brought about by the capitalists, coming into place only when workers have ceased to belong to themselves, being purely functional to the increase in the efficiency and productivity of labor. As such, it leaves no space for the manifold expressions of solidarity and the many institutions for mutual support, associations, societies, brotherhoods, alliances, that Kropotkin found present among the industrial population of his time. As Kropotkin noted, these very forms of mutual aid put limits to the power of capital and the state over the workers' lives, enabling countless proletarians not to fall into utter ruin, and sowing the seeds of self-managed insurance system, guaranteeing some protection against unemployment, illness, old age, and death. Typical of the limits of Marx's perspective is his utopian vision in the Fragment on the Machines, in the Grundrisse, 1857 through 58, where he projects a world in which machines do all the work and human beings only tend to them, functioning as their supervisors. This picture, in fact, ignores that even in advanced capitalist countries, much of the socially necessary labor consists of reproductive activities, and that this work has proven irreducible to mechanization. Only minimally can the needs, desires, possibilities of older people or people outside the waged workplace be addressed by incorporating technologies into the work by which they are reproduced. The automation of the elder care is a path already well traveled. As Nancy Fulber, the leading feminist economist and theorist of elder care in the United States, has shown, Japanese industries are quite advanced in the attempt to technologize it, as they are generally in the production of interactive robots. Nursebots giving people baths or walking them for exercise, and companion robots, robotic dogs, teddy bears, are already available on the market, although at prohibitive costs. We also know that televisions and personal computers have become surrogate bandanti for many elders. Electronically commanded wheelchairs enhance the mobility of those who are sufficiently in charge of their movements to master their commands. These scientific and technological developments can greatly benefit older people if they are made affordable to them. The circulation of knowledge they provide certainly places a great wealth at their disposal, but this cannot replace the labor of care workers, especially in the case of elders living alone or suffering from illness and disabilities. As Fulber points out, robotic partners can even increase people's loneliness and isolation. Nor can automation address the predicaments, fear, anxieties, loss of identity, and sense of one's dignity that people experience as they age and become dependent on others for the satisfaction of even their most basic needs. It is not technological innovation that is needed to address the question of elder care, but a change in social relations, whereby the valorization of capital no longer commands social activity and reproduction become a collective process. This, however, will not be possible within a Marxist framework, short of a major rethinking of the question of work, of the type feminists began in the 1970s as part of our political discussion of the function of housework and the origin of gender-based discrimination. Feminists have rejected the centrality that Marxism has historically assigned to waged industrial work and commodity production as the crucial sites for social transformation, and they have criticized its neglect of the reproduction of human beings and labor power. The feminist movement's lesson has been not only is reproduction the pillar of the social factory, but changing the conditions under which we reproduce ourselves is an essential part of our ability to create self-reproducing movements. For ignoring that the personal is political greatly undermines the strength of our struggle. On this matter, contemporary Marxists are not ahead of Marx. Taking the autonomous Marxist theory of effective and immaterial labor as an example, we see that it still sidesteps the rich problem that the feminist analysis of reproductive work in capitalism uncovered. This theory argues that in the present phase of capitalist development, the distinction between production and reproduction has become totally blurred as work becomes the production of states of being, effects, and immaterial rather than physical objects. In this sense, effective labor is a component of every forms of work rather than a specific form of reproduction. The examples given of the ideal type effective laborers are the fast food female workers who must flip hamburgers at McDonald's with a smile, or the stewardess who must sell a sense of security to the people she attends to. But such examples are deceptive, for most reproductive work, as exemplified by the care for the elderly, demands a complete engagement with the persons to be reproduced, a relation that can hardly be conceived as immaterial. It is important, however, to recognize that the concept of care work is also to some extent reductive. The term has entered the common usage in the 1980s and 1990s in conjuncture with the emergence of a new division of labor within reproductive work, separating the physical from the emotional aspects of this work. Paid care workers have held on to this distinction, wishing to specify the jobs that can be expected of them from their employers, and establish that the work they provide is skilled labor. But the distinction is untenable, and care workers are the first to recognize it, for what differentiates the reproduction of human beings from the production of commodities is the holistic character of many of the tasks involved. Indeed, to the extent that a separation is introduced, to the extent that elderly people, or for that matter children, are fed, washed, combed, massaged, given medicines, without any consideration for their emotional, affective response and general state of being, we enter a world of radical alienation. The theory of effective labor ignores this problem and the complexity involved in the reproduction of life. It also suggests that all forms of work in post-industrial capitalism are increasingly homogenized. Yet a brief look at the organization of elder care as currently constituted dispels the solution. Women, aging, and elder care in the perspective of feminist economics. As feminist economics have argued, the crisis of elder care, whether considered from the viewpoint of the elders or their care providers, is essentially a gender question. Although increasingly commodified, most care work is still done by women and in the form of unpaid labor that does not entitle them to any pension. Thus, paradoxically, the more women care for others, the less they can receive in return. Because they devote less time to waged labor than men, and many social insurance plans are calculated on the years of waged work done. Paid caregivers, too, as we have seen, are affected by the devaluation of reproductive work, forming an underclass that still must fight to be socially recognized as workers. In sum, because of the devaluation of reproductive work, almost everywhere women face old age with fewer resources than men, measured in terms of family support, monetary incomes, and available assets. In the United States, where pensions and Social Security are calculated on years of employment, women are the largest group of elderly who are poor and the largest number of residents of low-income nursing homes, the concentration camps of our time, precisely because they spend so much of their lives outside of the waged workforce in activities not recognized as work. Science and technology cannot resolve this problem. What is required is a transformation in the social sexual division of labor and, above all, the recognition of reproductive work as work, entitling those performing it to remuneration so that family members providing care are not penalized for their work. The recognition and valorization of reproductive work is also crucial for overcoming the divisions that exist among care workers, which pit, on one side, the family members trying to minimize their expenses, and, on the other, the hired caregivers facing the demoralizing consequences of working at the edge of poverty and devaluation. Feminist economists working on this issue have articulated possible alternatives to the present systems. In Warm Hands in Cold Age, Nancy Fulber, Louise B. Shaw, and Agneta Stark discuss the reforms needed to give security to the aging population, especially elderly women, by taking an international perspective and evaluating which countries are in the lead in this respect. At the top, they place the Scandinavian countries that provide almost universal systems of insurance. At the bottom, there are the United States and England, where elderly assistance is tied to the history of employment. But in both cases, there is a problem in the way policies are configured, as they reflect an unequal sexual division of labor and the traditional expectations concerning women's role in the family and society. This is one crucial area where change must occur. Fulber also calls for a redistribution of resources to rechannel public money from the military-industrial complex and other destructive enterprises to the care of people in old age. She acknowledges that this may seem unrealistic, equivalent to calling out for a revolution, but she insists that it should be placed on our agenda, for the future of every worker is at stake, and a society blind to the tremendous suffering that awaits so many people once they age, as it is the case with the United States today, is a society bound for self-destruction. There is no sign, however, that this blindness may soon be overcome. In the name of economic crisis, policymakers are turning their eyes away from it, everywhere striving to cut social spending and bring state pensions and social security systems, including subsidies to care for work, under the axe. The dominant refrain is the obsessive complaint that the more vital and energetic elderly population, stubbornly insisting on living on, is making even the provision of state-funded pensions unsustainable. It was possible, with in mind the millions of Americans determined on living past 80, that Alan Greenspan in his memoirs confessed that he was frightened when realizing that the Clinton administration had actually accumulated a financial surplus. Even before the crisis, however, for years policymakers had been orchestrating a generational war, incessantly warning that the growth of the 65-plus population would bankrupt the Social Security system, leaving a heavy mortgage on the shoulders of the younger generations. Now, as the crisis deepens, the assault on assistance to old age and elder care is bound to escalate, whether in the form of hyperinflation decimating fixed incomes, or the partial privatization of social security systems, or the rising retirement age. What is certain is that no one is arguing for an increase in government funding for elder care. It is urgent, then, that social justice movements, including radical scholars and activists, intervene on this terrain to prevent a triage solution to the crisis at the expense of the old, and to formulate initiatives capable of bringing together the different social subjects who are implicated in the question of elder care: care workers, the families of the elders, and the first of all the elders themselves, who are now often placed in an antagonist relationship with each other. We are already seeing examples of such an alliance in some of the struggle over elder care, as nurses and patients, paid care workers, and families of their clients are increasingly coming together to jointly confront the state, aware that when the relations of reproduction become antagonistic, both producers and reproduced pay the price. Meanwhile, the commoning of reproductive/care work is also underway. Communal forms of living based upon solidarity contracts are currently being created in some Italian cities by elders who, in order to avoid being institutionalized, pool together their efforts and resources when they cannot count on their families or hire a care worker. In the United States, communities of care are being formed by the younger generations of political activists who aim at socializing, collectivizing the experience of illness, pain, grieving, and the care work involved in this process, beginning to reclaim and redefine what it means to be ill, to age, and to die. These efforts need to be expanded. They are essential to a reorganization of our everyday life and the creation of non-exploitative social relations. For the seeds of the new world will not be planted online, but in the cooperation we can develop among ourselves, starting from those of us who must face the most vulnerable time in our lives without the resources and help they need, a hidden but no doubt widespread form of torture in our society.